There we go. There we go. Well, hello everyone. Welcome back to a very exciting episode of the Storybox podcast. Today, my friends, is going to be a very intellectual and highly thought-provoking conversation, I have no doubt, because today I had Professor Robin Hanson on the Storybox. Now, for those of you that don't know who he is, he's an associate professor of economics at George Mason University and a research associate at the Future of Humanity Institute of Oxford University. Very prestigious university, if you guys know of that university. He has a PhD in social science from Caltech, master's in physics and physiology from U Chicago, and he's worked for 9 years in artificial intelligence, believe it or not, as a research programmer at Lockheed, and NASA. Far out. He's helped pioneer the field of prediction markets too. He's got two books, which are pretty cool. The first one is The Age of M, Work, Love, and Life When Robots Rule the Earth. And the other one is The Elephant in the Brain, which I found is very, very fascinating. Hidden Motives in Everyday Life. You've got a blog, which people can go check out, called overcomingbias.com, where you write very interesting blog post. I have to say, I've read a couple of them and it took me a couple of days to process what you were saying. But you've done over, I think it is 3,660 plus citations and 720 media mentions. You got a couple of TED Talks as well. But can I welcome you so much to the Storybox podcast today, Professor Robin Hanson?
I'm happy to be here. So what shall we talk about?
We're going to talk about a lot of things. It's going to be, a non-linear conversation.
Let's pick one.
But my first question for you, my friend, is this is a question I'm curious to know your response to because of your kind of work. But what do you believe, or what does success look like for you?
For me, success is achieving my ambitions. And my ambitions are primarily or focally sort of to have intellectual insight that adds to important topics, that matters and is big, and that, gets accepted and assimilated and built upon by the rest of the world. So I want to sort of add to the great edifice of knowledge that we're all creating together and make an important brick that gets added to it.
Why specifically is that success for you? Has it been this gradual thing over the course of your life that you've realized at different points, or is there more of a catalyst moment somewhere?
I think, like a lot of young men, I was looking for glory. I was looking for an image of glory that I could aspire to, and coming across, intellectual people who had achieved great things, like, say, Einstein. Those were held up as an ideal of something that one could hope to do if one was good enough and worked hard enough, and that could matter a lot. That could not just be impressive, but it could be useful. And so that's what I decided early on that was what I was shooting for. And I've continued to sort of hold that out as my goal.
What age were you, my friend, that you realized that this was something that you wanted to pursue, like the economics, predictions, all this sort of stuff? Was that something more later on in life, or was it just having these intellectual conversations, deeper thoughts, trying to understand the world a little bit better? Was that, what age were you?
So just as a new college student, I could be inspired by the physics that I saw at the time and how grand it could be. I, of course, knew many other topics. I think it took time for me to aspire to learn many topics and to find my own topics on which I might find glory. So initially, I would accept the framing I was given in terms of the kind of topics there were and the kinds of questions that were important. And I would aspire to answer the questions that other people would pose as important. But then over time, I learned many things and came to see how there are many gaps between, the various fields where people focus and the places between where there's not as much attention. And I came to question or doubt many sort of common assumptions that are made. And so I came to have more of an aspiration to sort of reframe or rethink things. And then I could see someone like Einstein, not just as someone who had made a great achievement, but who did that in part via reconceiving and reframing the questions he was given, not just accepting them in their terms, but stepping back and re-asking the questions. And that's become important to me. That is, over time, I think what I've gotten especially good at is knowing many things and being able to step back, reorganize them, re-ask them, and find the holes, find the missing places between things, and sort of rejudge what is important, what are the questions, and then, making contributions, perhaps primarily of the form, hey, you've been thinking about this wrong. If you think about it this way, you can make a lot more progress.
Is there one particular question that you have at the moment that you haven't really been able to find much of an answer to?
Oh, probably. I don't tend to focus on the things that I struggle with. I tend to look opportunistically for the things that are promising. I guess the most fundamental obstacle that stands out to me is that it's hard to make people care about what's important. So I can judge what's important, and then I can go figure out what seems to be important and figure out contributions on that. And from my point of view, they're kind of obvious why they're important, but it's actually hard to make other people care.
Yep.
That is, even if they acknowledge that they're important, they just don't seem very interested. So that's, in some sense, the biggest obstacle I face is, so once upon a time, I thought, how could I save the world? And thinking about how to save the world is like, what could we do that such that if we did it, it would save the world? And then I think I came up with things that actually kind of meet that criteria. And then what I didn't expect was I could tell those to the world, and I could have arguments to explain why those would be the answers to all the world's big problems, and they wouldn't care. They wouldn't be interested. That I didn't anticipate that. I didn't think that would be the big problem.
The big question is really, does the world exactly need saving?
Or want saving?
Yeah.
I mean, of course, in some sense, if there are big problems it has, and I can find big solutions, then from my point of view, the big solutions are solving big problems, and the world needs those, right? But the world may not want them.
Yeah, I've noticed that as well. I mean, there's big issues that people have been trying to solve now for years, but there seems to be like this huge blowback. And it's kind of like, okay, so we've got this problem. We know it's a problem, but yet we're trying to come up with these solutions, but you don't want the solutions at the same time that we've got the problem happening, and it's growing. It's getting worse. So what do we do? And then there's more problems that keep forming as a result. So I think you're right in that respect. I mean, we can spend so much time thinking about all these solutions. We can offer all these solutions, but trying to convince someone that they need to be implemented, I think we're behind the 8 ball. That's just from my understanding. I could be. Yeah.
I think it's even more fundamentally that like people only accept a certain range of problems as problems they're willing even to consider being problems. I mean, there's a sense in which, like, if somebody's car is broken, they want it fixed, or if their kid is struggling in school, they want their kid to do better. But larger sort of ways we could change bigger things, they're not really in the market for those. They kind of assume the world's a certain way, and they aren't really interested in considering changes. So many of the solutions to our big problems would require somewhat big changes. And for many people, even most people, I think, they're not really interested in considering big changes. That's just not on the agenda, not something that they're open to.
Yeah. Do you think that's ultimately a flaw of being a human, is not wanting to accept big changes?
Well, I'd say a fundamental flaw of humans is that we have pretty abstract minds, and we're able to consider pretty abstract arguments and considerations and plans, and we're willing to think on long time scales and large spatial scales, and we're willing to go deep into the nature of physics. And there's just a lot of things we're capable of understanding and talking about. But our basic values are just this hodgepodge of desires and inclinations and sort of context-dependent triggers. And that's what we want in a sense. And we don't have sort of a high-level abstract description of our goals. So it's hard to motivate us to think abstractly about things because the things we care about are relatively concrete, being hungry, stubbing our toe, etc. And we can only really be motivated if some discussion gets close to one of those pretty concrete, things that prod us to action.
Right.
And so, our values are encoded in a lot of just very concrete heuristics and prods.
Yeah.
And that's how evolution sort of designed us initially. And this abstract reasoning is clearly an add-on. And clearly the value encoding part has not been moved over to the abstract part.
Yeah.
The abstract part has to sort of translate everything it does down to some concrete things that will then trigger these concrete value triggers. And that's, I think, a feature that will eventually go away. That is, I think our distant descendants will no longer be like that. And that will be a big change, a way in which they're quite different from us. But for now, in order to motivate anyone to think about anything, you'll have to connect it to one of their concrete passions.
Do you think that, so if we look at the past and our ancestors, right, and how they lived compared to how we're living today, do you think that we've gotten 10 times worse over that period of time?
Well, I mean, there are so many different dimensions we can evaluate. What do you have in mind as terms of worse versus better, I guess? So, I mean, if you want to look for like overall metrics, like clearly we together are vastly more capable than we were because we can support a vastly larger population and a vastly higher standard of living. So by that measure of our abilities, we together are vastly superior than we once were. Now, there are many other measures that you could point to, and then on some of those will be worse, but that's certainly one worth noticing.
Why you talk about in your book, the elephant in the brain, sorry. Why are humans innately wired to be political? Why are we?
Well, so first of all, we're social.
Yeah.
That is, the main environment for our ancestors was other humans. Humans were in such large numbers, so close to each other, that other threats were in the background. They could together deal quite effectively with most other threats, but the main threat they had more trouble with was each other. So humans, therefore, paid close attention to each other, and they tried to form groups and coalitions that would help each other. And politics is about sort of larger scale group coalitions. And so larger scale group coalitions are an important part of our coalitional behavior. And that's why politics is important. That is, we are primed to find a group of people that we can be part of, that we will show loyalty to them and hope that they will show loyalty to us, and that we will gain advantages by being part of that larger group. Now, of course, we gain by being parts of smaller groups, like, say, a set of friends or family, but we also perceive that in some community of 100 people, say, that will break into some pretty big subgroups, and we want to be part of one of those big subgroups. That's also important. And that's what politics is. It's where we join the largest groups that seem relevant to us in the big decisions being made.
What would happen to us as a human race if we didn't have politics as part of everyday life, like everyday interaction?
Well, I mean, it's quite conceivable that we might learn to do that. That is, for 1 million years, at least, we lived in small groups of, say, 30 people. And politics in that group meant, the group of 15 most like us compared to the other group of 15 or something. And so that group of 15 are people we interact with a lot. And so that makes politics personal. And, which means there isn't much distinction between personal and politics. Yeah. You have personal relationships with all these 30 people, and you are considering their political relationship to you as part of your relationship to them. Now, in the modern world, where we've got billions of people, we do have political affiliations with our immediate associates, but we haven't quite learned that those aren't the central channel by which we influence the political world, or that we haven't sort of switched our orientation. In fact, today, for most of us, the main way we relate to politics is by relating to the people around us in terms of, do we share their politics? And that's overwhelmingly priority for politics in our world. And so the actual, say, elections and legislatures and presidents and all that sort of stuff, that's all a side effect from our point of view of our trying to show our associates that we're on their side. So we could eventually perhaps coordinate better to actually more effectively channel our influence through these larger units of elections, et cetera. And that would be a different world. And that might be a more productive world from our individual point of view, at least, because now, even though we talk as if we care a lot about politics, we're paying a lot of attention to it, we're mainly paying attention to it in order to influence the immediate associates to show them that, say, we're on their same side.
So we've got two, or more or less three sides, pretty much. You got the people in the middle that are undecided. They just don't want any part of, like, I'm independent, leave me alone kind of thing.
Yeah.
This is the American politics, if I'm getting this right. You got the Republicans on the right, you got the Democrats on the left. So one side is trying to destroy the other side, it seems like, for the most part. They're just like constantly blaming each other for a lot of things, and nothing good really seems to get done. Is that really, I guess this is probably a dumb question, but that doesn't seem to be really productive. So is there a better way to move forward and still have politics as part of our society?
So there's a bunch of different things to do this. So first you're talking about the sides. In principle, there's this vast high dimensional space of all these features and positions we could be on. And so in principle, we're all distributed in this very high dimensional space. But there seems to be this natural process by which a single dimension gets picked out. And then we tend to align ourselves along that dimension. And then we suppress or pay less attention to all the other dimensions.
Right.
And so in principle, there are just lots of kinds of people in all these other dimensions, but we say, oh, I don't care about that. We care about this one main dimension. And we compress or all this variety into this one main dimension. So that seems to be a natural result of this coalition politics process by which we sort of form groups that help each other. And so we're each trying to show that we're with our group. And so if we focus too much on other dimensions, people worry about our loyalty compared to the one big dimension they're all focused on. And so that's a natural process, and it looks kind of robust. Now, that process has long been moderated and, held in check by competition with outsides. So in some sense, we have this fractal structure of we've got groups broken into groups, and each group could tend to form an axis of difference within it, but that will be moderated by the idea that we have these outside groups, and if we don't act unified enough, then they'll take our lunch. They will lose. And that's been true all through history for all sides of groups, and even for nations like the United States. When outside threats seem strong enough, then we, compromise on our inside differences, and we, find a way to get along and make things happen. Yeah. So I would say, at the moment, as you may know, the degree of polarization in the United States is at a peak relative not just to the rest of the world, but also relative to, say, the last century. Okay, so we're at an unusual peak. So if you want to ask about the United States today, you need to be asking somewhat different question than about just generic political polarization all through history and space, right? So there's always been some degree of polarization, but there's always been some degree of infighting in any set of groups, but it's usually held in check by outside threats. So we could ask about why the US is unusually different and what we could do about that. Or we could just ask about the usual kinds of polarization in most groups through all of history.
Yeah.
Well, which one would you like?
There's so many different political structures. You've got, I guess, for an extreme example, or what I think in the Western world is an extreme example, is North Korea, their dictatorship. And then you've got, hopefully then I'll listen to this, the Russian political sphere as well. Then you got kind of like the more, I struggle saying with democratic, with the things that are going on these days, but democratic society here in Australia and in the US and other sort of Western civilized countries. So it just seems to me like the big question is, if you look at history for most of the time, these structures have just been going up and down, up and down. One time things are absolutely crazy. So I think we've got to look at the person, the individual, the one that is making the decisions more than just the actual construct, if that makes sense. Is that right?
Well, I mean, the first thing I just say is if you want to understand just human behavior in general and humans in general, if you focus on politics, you are focusing on this thing that humans are prone to focus on. Yeah. So, I mean, you might want to therefore understand it, but you also want to be cautious and not get stuck into the same problem everybody else is stuck in, is focusing overwhelmingly on politics. That is, when people get together, they are prone to talk politics far out of proportion to its fundamental importance. And it's just the thing they like to talk about. Yeah. And of course, in a world that's more polarized like ours, they all the more want to focus on it. And in some sense, like when there's not a there to focus on, they focus on all the meta issues. So they talk about like, well, who said something wrong about it, and who made it, and who's not being fair about it, and who is paying too much attention to it, and who is, so basically people are so eager to talk about it that if there's not like a concrete thing like, Russia invading Ukraine to talk about, or some other, coronavirus policy to talk about, they just go wild talking on all the meta things you could talk about because they just really want to talk about it. So that's, worth mentioning what I just said. I was just talking about it too, but I was trying to talk about it in an abstract, general sense to help you understand why everybody is so obsessed with talking about it, and therefore maybe tempt you to back away, to like maybe look at something else. There's other things going on in human behavior besides politics, but we do want to understand, well, why are people so obsessed with politics? What's the driving energy? And as we said, the key energy is trying to show loyalty to associates. So today, if you ask about discrimination and what sort of characteristics people are willing to discriminate on, politics stands out at the top. They're quite willing to discriminate. They don't want their child to marry someone of the other political party. That if you gave them a money or scholarship, they'd make sure it went to somebody on their side. All the way down the list, people are just quite eager, and they're quite willing to attribute the other side of the political spectrum to being evil in the ways they aren't for lots of other degrees. Politics has become this central axis of our moral framing and our allegiances.
So, okay, finishing up on the sort of politics side of things, I want to steer the conversation more towards human behavior, more or less, and understand why people do, like, so we've got, for example, we've got great leaders in society and we've got bad leaders in society. Why is it that one person goes one way and the other person goes another way? Why is that the case? Is it because more or less is a choice, or is it because of social constructs, how they've grown up, them making that own innate decision, or just how they're wired?
I think if you just took any other decisions people make, you would realize that you do roughly understand the range of things that influence those choices. You ask, why does somebody order chicken or beef at the restaurant, or why do they wear a hat, or why do they go into management or sales or whatever else it is. We just talked about Monday decisions. I think most people would see this sort of full range of influences. Yeah, there's some genetic influences. There's your family. There's your immediate options. There's some personal opportunity. There's some randomness about who tends to suggest things. I think if we go to sort of familiar decisions like that, people don't feel puzzled in explaining those things, right? And so now if you say, well, why does a leader go bad, and you act puzzled, I'm going to say, you're acting more puzzled than you are. You're just trying to be outraged about politics, and you're trying to pretend that who could possibly understand how those other people would differ from my perfectly reasonable best opinion. And not noticing that in all these other areas of life, you would find it perfectly understandable how you're not a teacher, but you could understand how somebody else might be a teacher. You don't wear boots, but you could understand why somebody else might boots. You could just understand all those things quite easily until we get to politics, or something where you're sort of morally framing it as my side is right and their side is a travesty and an outrage. So I would say you already know the answer in that sense.
So if we were to look at human behavior at the moment and the things that are going on currently with different sort of people, there are a lot of unrest, a lot of ideas, a lot of all these things going on in our world, is it right to predict that it's going to get 10 times worse in the future? Or is it right to predict as well that we going to get
so just always notice we should make a distinction when we're trying to explain behavior. Are we trying to explain just the middle of the distribution, just the typical things people do, or are we trying to explain some deviations, including trends, right?
Okay.
So if we want to say, why is the United States different than, Sudan? That's a different question than just why are humans on average some way?
That's a big
and
question.
If we want to say, why is the US different today than it was 80 years ago? That's also a different question than just the general thing. So my first cut usually is to just try to understand the average. Just people have typically gone to the doctor, people have typically gone to school, people typically get married, whatever it is, right? And just say, do we understand these just typical average behaviors? Because if you don't understand them, you're not going to have much of a hope of understanding the trends or changes or variations, right? That's going to be the first thing you have the best shot at understanding. And so the book, The Elephant in the Brain, is mostly focused on understanding those averages, those typical features. But there are these differences, and they are perfectly valid to ask questions about. But again, you first want to figure out the causes of the typical behavior, and then you could try to figure out what causes the difference. So if you say, why is political polarization at an unusual high in the United States in this moment in time? That's, again, a little harder question than just asking, why is there political polarization at all ever? But we could try to do it. I think my first cut explanation would be to say that it's like inequality. Inequality seems to consistently grow after major wars and disasters in times of peace and prosperity. And then it falls again in major wars and disasters. Basically, disasters hit the rich a lot harder than they hit everybody else in terms of their percentage effect on their wealth and their status, et cetera. That's just, so if you see inequality is high today and you say, what's the solution? And I say, well, look, the usual solution is a big war or a pandemic or some big disaster, civil war that just destroys lots of stuff. I might say, you should hope it continues to increase because you don't want one of those fixes. That's not so good. Okay. Live with the inequality if you can, because it's a sign of prosperity and peace, which are things you like. And I might also say the same, long periods of peace and prosperity are what also cause a focus on internal divisions. That is, as external threats fade and the memory of them fades, and you haven't experienced them much and you're not afraid of them and they don't seem to come to mind, then you just feel more free to have internal conflicts. This is also true in, say, a firm or a club or anything else. If you've got one religion and you're just focused on the other people in your religion, you'll form schisms and different denominations. If you're part of a denomination, you're trying to promote your denomination over the others, then you'll make peace and you'll, try to promote together your denomination. So basically, the United States is at a peak of a long period of peace and prosperity and success. Winning wars and being the leader of the world means that we just don't feel very afraid. And of course, you've got two huge oceans to protect ourselves from invaders as well. And so I would just say the United States is gaining the fruits and benefits of a long period of peace and prosperity. We have more inequality and we have more political polarization. And that's a problem because it means it's just going to get worse until you get one of these fixes that you don't want. You don't want one of the sort of standard fixes here. So you want to live with it.
Yeah. I mean, it's a curious thing that we have been in this long time of peace and what would seem as prosperity. So it kind of looks like just around the corner is sadly times of upheaval and civil unrest. We're getting signs of it at the moment. So it's easy to kind of predict that that's just around the corner. I mean, you hope that it's not, but then again, I'm curious about, can't we motivate people to continue down the road of continual peace, or is that not really a possibility? Like we're doomed to have people motivated towards war?
Well, so I think the more consistent you see a trend in history, the more you should expect that trend to continue unless you can identify some key way that the world has changed. So this pattern of increasing polarization and infighting as long periods of peace and prosperity is a pretty consistent long-term trend. So you'll have to ask, well, if you hope for a change now, what exactly are you hoping for? Now, I don't necessarily think that we are going to have a civil war or anything soon. Actually, what I'm more predicting, but I'm not sure I like it, is that one side wins. If you think about it, like in most cities in the United States or even in the world, they aren't divided equally into two political parties. There's just one party that wins, that has taken over, right? Similarly, in most firms, there isn't two equal divided sides, vying for the position of the CEO. Somebody's in the CEO and they are dominating the rest of the firm. Everybody's kind of has to pledge allegiance to them. Most ancient empires were not divided into two equal fighting sides. They had one side that beat the other. Now, democracy in certain kind of environments can create a pressure toward this equal division through what's called the median voter theorem, the idea that the parties will adjust to roughly split in order to split the vote. But that's only as long as democracy is actually the main driving force that decides who's in power. That doesn't have to continue. And so, honestly, my best guess for how this increasing polarization ends is one side wins and crushes the other side. But without a civil war, they just win. So then outcomes are less determined by a median voter. So just like in a city, if there's a city who's mainly determined by one party winning, then contesting for power has to be done within that party. And to the extent that that party doesn't allow much contesting of power, then there's just some sort of insider elite group that's just maintaining themselves and continuing, right? That sort of thing could happen at, say, the national level in the United States, where, so basically if you ask, well, which side would win? I would say, let's just look at the other peaks of power, the other high grounds, military high grounds in the United States. If we say media, law, civil service, academia, tech, the military, we can just go through the medicine. We just go through the high grounds. Each of those high grounds can be taken over by one side in this battle. And if that one side takes over enough of these high grounds, that will give it a position of power for which to sort of just win the overall war. And I think you can guess which side that is at the moment.
Yes.
So that's just the straightforward prediction, is that they managed to, build on those bases of power to win.
And then in today's day and age as well, with the technological advancements that we have available at our fingertips, it doesn't seem like it'll be very, very long at all. Like if it was a civil war, right, it didn't seem to be like it'd be long at all. It'd be very, very short or quick. Or is that?
I think civil wars can be just long and deadly and damaging if there's enough, of course, participants who are willing to fight. I certainly hope. I'm not willing to roll those dice on a civil war. I'd rather avoid it. But certainly, repressive governments have more powers today to. But I think their increasing powers are more in the form of surveillance and just finding out about their opponents and, cutting off their opponents' growth in the bud at early stages. I think that's mostly what the increasing powers are. And we've seen those be actually pretty effective.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a deep thinker with these sort of things. So I'm like looking at what the news is saying. I'm looking at what history's already given us and just trying to piece together what's really going on as best I possibly can.
I mean, I think if you're trying to be honest, you want to stand back from your living in this age. Just imagine that you were reading a history of this age from some other age and just asking, what would you guess if you were just reading this history from some distant vantage point?
That's what I do. Yeah.
And so in which case you don't want to be so hopeful, right? You're not going to, say, well, I sure wish these sides would win, therefore I predict they'll win. You might know who you wish would win, but you also might know who you guess will win.
So going past, I guess, I think we've been, going past all this stuff into some more exciting things that are going to happen in the future. I guess you're looking at technology advancements, AI, artificial intelligence, and all those things, which I think it's cool in one respect. But for me, looking at it like the kind of things like implanting chips like Elon Musk is doing, he implanted a chip into a monkey, I think it was not long ago. So human trials, I think, is just around the corner. But what are some other things that you predict coming in the realm of technology with our economy, all those aspects? I know it's probably a broad and big question, so lots to talk about there.
Well, for that sort of thing, everything depends on what time scale you're interested in. So I think it's just really easy to see that if you look on a long enough time scale, you have to expect really large changes. Because if you look in the past on longer time scales, you see really large changes. So I think that means if you're looking on a century or 1,000 years, you have to be expecting enormous changes in the world and our lives. So I think right there, that's what gives people pause, because again, we talked about how people mainly react to the immediate things around them. And if you try to give them a vivid image of a world changed that much, their major reaction is repulsion. It's just, if there was a room like that, would they walk through the door? No. They would stay out of that room, right? If there was a cave, you can go in the cave and you'd be in that whole other world. They would be very cautious about going through that door into the cave, right? Because they are in a world they understand, that's familiar, that they like, and they would be quite reluctant to go through that door. So if you present an image of some very different world, then they are just universally put off, right? Mm. And then if you connect that and you say, well, this thing that's happening right now, this Elon Musk, chip in a monkey, that's a connection to that strange world. That's leading us to that strange world. Then people go, then I don't want that either. Because that looks like it's leading to that other place they're afraid of. It's not even so much that they're against it as it's just strange and foreign and not safe, right? Unknown. And that's enough just to want to stay back. Yeah. So, with respect to, your question, I need to ask, like, what time scale you want to talk about. If you want to talk about 5 years or 30 years or 100 years or 1,000 years, or even 1,000,000 years, each of those time scales should have very different answers to what do I see coming.
Well, that's interesting for me because, like, I thought, we'd get certain things that would be 10 years down the track and we're getting them like they look like they're only about a year, 2 years away. So it kind of feels like to me, there are certain things that are happening in our world with artificial intelligence, with robots being able to do things that is just like super, super quick. So I don't really know the best.
Well, if we took AI, I'd say, we're still a long way off from really big disruptive changes. So
how long?
Many decades.
Huh. Why is that?
Maybe 3 to 30 decades.
Is that
because they aren't actually changing that much so far? That is, they haven't actually gotten much customer revenue from the products they've been introducing lately. We're not in a revolution. So actually, a year ago or so, I published this paper where we had looked at automation over the previous 20 years. And we looked at in the whole United States, we looked at 800 different jobs. And for each job, how automated it was in each year. And then we looked at a bunch of other features of jobs. So we could say how much had automation changed in those 20 years. And we could say what predicts whether automation changes or not. And we could also say, when automation changes, does that change wages or the number of workers? And basically, when automation changes, it does not change wages or number of workers. And automation didn't change that much in 20 years. And the things that predict whether automation changes had not changed in 20 years. That is, we have basically the same kind of automation now as we did 20 years ago. And it's not changing that much, and it's not having that big of impacts when it does. So we're just not in a position to worry about it right now.
Yeah. Do you foresee any of that, science fiction stuff coming to play in our real world, like eventually in the next, say, 10, 15 years?
So you have to say which science fiction stuff you have in mind. I could tell you what I think the most science fiction-y change that will happen in the next 30 years is.
Oh, please do.
So I think that's remote work. Yeah. So we've just had this big push toward remote work in the last 2 years of the pandemic. We're going to see a retrenchment as the pandemic fades, but we're also over the next few decades going to see that continuing to grow. And that, I think, is the biggest change we're likely to see over the next 30 years, because the key point is that when you do jobs via remote work, now you allow a much larger world to compete for each of those jobs. And then you allow a much larger firms to organize around doing those jobs with much more divisions of labor. So it's the difference between like doing something at a very local level and having it in a city where you can specialize, right? Yeah. So if you think of, say, plumbers today, plumbers are very local. They don't specialize very much. Mm. Each plumber is near their customers, and therefore they have to be able to do a lot of kinds of plumbing, and they don't specialize very much in any one because you need a plumber to show up and be right there. But if plumbing was done by remote work, it would be more like an automobile factory, right? There'd be hundreds of workers, each of whom did one very specialized task, and they would get, huge efficiencies from specializing in the way that, say, an automobile factory gets efficiencies for specializing. And of course, you could have people all over the world competing for that. Yeah. And so that's a huge gain that we can get as we are able to take jobs and tasks and industries and make them more remote. And one of the main things that requires is better avatars, better like local physical representations of somebody working, but that's not too far off. That's not that hard. No. And so that's my best guess for the biggest change over the next 30 years, say. Now, that's not full AI. It'll make AI a little easier. So once somebody's doing something remotely, if you have an AI that can do the task instead of a person, it's easier to swap it in. Yeah. Just for the plumber lines things up and he's ready to solder. And instead of soldering it himself, he pushes the solder button and an AI does the soldering, right? Huh. And then, the next steps, right? So you can interleave doing something yourself and having automation do a task when it's all being done remotely. Hmm. Right. And so that'll help AI, but I still don't think AI will be the big thing. I'd say remote work will be the big thing.
So just so I can understand this better, pretty much in the next 30 years, I guess we're predicting that pretty much every single industry will have some form of remote work attached to it.
Well, not every industry, but just more of them will switch that way.
Yeah. Okay.
So now there's a limited number of industries now that are, relatively dominated by remote work. Yeah. Like, say, software or call centers. Now perhaps starting education. There are a number of industries wherein remote work is becoming more dominant, and they're changing. But most industries are not, right? Most things you get in your city around you, there's a person living near you who does it.
Mm. Does that remove the human connection factor?
Well, to the same degree that it's already removed it in those other industries that are now dominated by remote work, it changes it certainly. It modifies it and makes it better in some ways and worse in others. But certainly. But since right now we're having a remote conversation, clearly we've gotten used to it to some degree in a lot of areas of life.
Yeah, I mean,
so honestly, I don't think the immediate remote connection will bother people that much. I think they'll be more bothered by the larger scale changes in response. So for example, there'll be large multinational firms that say provide things like plumbing. In which case, it'll be harder to regulate plumbing from national regulations because one nation's regulations will less influence these multinational corporations. And your country will now need to specialize more in what it provides to the rest of the world. If you try to cut off your country from the rest of the world, you won't gain as much for these big multinationals doing remote work. And so you'll need to become part of this tighter world market for remote work, but then you lose some of your national autonomy, the ability to control these things from your nation. And that'll bother people a lot.
Yeah. I mean, we're already seeing not Elon Musk, Zuckerberg doing things like Meta, the VR metaverse and all those things, which, it looks cool from the outside. From my perspective, I always think, what would podcasting look like in, say, the next 10 years when we've got VR, we've got our own avatars?
I'm pretty skeptical there. I just don't think that'll make much of a difference. But
I don't think
I'm also somewhat skeptical about crypto. I mean, I guess I'm less skeptical about crypto than about VR.
I'm skeptical about crypto, NFTs, all those digital currencies. I mean, there's a huge hype and there's a huge build up towards it. But
and there will be something left over after a crash, but still it's overrated.
Yeah.
On average, the people who are invested at the moment will lose their money.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at, say, like Bitcoin, for example, or even in crypto, like one day it would be super high and the next day or even the next couple of minutes, it just drops significantly. Sure. So you got to be like extremely brave.
But look, so all through my life, there's people touting lots of different things, and you usually face a choice between criticizing what somebody else is touting or finding something worth supporting. And the world just doesn't reward the criticizing much, right? If there's a thing that's popular and then it goes away, if you're the guy who criticized it, you go away too. When it goes away, nobody cares about your criticism. And if it succeeds, then you look bad, right? So there's not a way to win criticizing something that you think will probably go away. Yeah. So you're, from your point of view, and maybe even social point of view, the best thing is to say, when you see something and say, no, I don't believe in that, instead of like elaborating on why and explaining it to everybody, go find something else that you can believe in, find more promising, and find a way to focus on that and build that up and support it and help it happen, right? Yeah. Now, maybe the world would benefit more from more of this criticism, but honestly, it doesn't reward it much. People just aren't very interested. So I think you got to ask what is interesting, what has promise, what are you looking for? So that's why I might, rather than listing all the things that are overhyped, I'll try to find, well, what are the few things that are underhyped? Yeah. And so remote work was one of those that I might give right there. Yeah. Now, another class of things that I'm excited by but can't really predict is just better institutions. So I specialize as an economist in thinking about institution designs, and I think there's enormous potential for better institutions. And I really wish a lot more attention and effort would go into prototyping and testing them in order to field them. That potential just remains for a long time. I don't know necessarily there'll be a boom in them, but at some point, those things will happen and be valuable.
We have the similar wavelength in that respect, even though I'm not an economist. I think the institutions can be better. They should be better. But the question is, will they? That's my thought process around it. And then, I think
unfortunately, the world is getting less willing to try things out there.
Yeah.
And so I actually think we don't have a strong world government, but we are increasingly having a stronger world mob. That is, the world is coming together more as a shared community of thought and values. And that's causing regulation to be uniform, surprisingly uniform around the world. And that's making people less willing to try new things out. So you might think in a big world, sure, if your place doesn't want to, the rules in your place won't let people try new things, somebody else will. And that's just becoming much less true because the whole world basically wants to do things the same way.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on, having said all that, the mob kind of mentality? Do you think that in the future we're going to have this thing called, one mind, one people kind of thing?
So humans, for 1 million years, and they lived in those groups of 30 people, they did that. Yeah. That is, communities of 30 people who lived basically by themselves, they would form a consensus and they would have the impression that they were of one mind about the things they had discussed. They might start out with a disagreement and then they would form a consensus. That is just how humans have behaved in small groups for a very long time. That's also true of most small work groups. Most small groups don't maintain sort of visible differences of opinion in over extended periods. They form an agreement and they form a consensus. So the major disagreements we've had are across groups who are more distant from each other and less connected. But as the world becomes more connected and unified, we are forming groups on this largest global scale. And elites are more so. That is the Davos crowd, et cetera. Those people travel a lot. They talk a lot with people across borders. They are more a global elite that is less tied to their nations. And, if there are dissident people who dissent from that, they tend to be more local, rural, non-elites.
Yeah.
And that's the world as it's appearing today. So honestly, sometimes the major axis of disagreement in the world today is becoming the global elites who agree, and then the other local, rural others who might disagree. Certainly how we've seen it in the pandemic.
Yep.
That is the world we're moving into, and it feels very satisfying to human nature. Humans have always been very frustrated by the fact that their larger worlds they live in can't function like the small groups that they were used to functioning in for a million years. They've always wondered, why can't we all just get along the way a group of 30 people does get along when they all live together for many years?
Yeah.
And now we are achieving that at the global level, but there will be costs.
Yeah. I was saying before this, or when we just found out about the pandemic, I'm like, it'll be this instance where the elites they'll take over, they'll make the majority of the decisions. So it'll be like almost the strong versus the weak. The strong will be the ones.
So it's interesting to notice if you distinguish between experts and elites,
yes,
there are two different kinds of people. So experts are people who have a particular role and they are assigned to know particular things. And elites are just people who are prestigious and smart, et cetera, who just talk among each other. But their opinions aren't so much, weighted by their expertise in the subject. They are just, so think about a talk at a conference or a panel discussion. At the talk, the speaker is presenting themselves as an expert on a topic, and they are telling you their expertise. But on a panel discussion, people are asked all sorts of questions that aren't things they necessarily are expert in, but nevertheless, they will still talk among themselves and form opinions. And that's more the elite mode, which is what elites do in parties and in legislatures and all around the world forever, right? That's the elite mode. So it was surprising to note that at the beginning of the pandemic, experts all said one sort of thing. And then the elites all of a sudden started talking together and they came to a different opinion.
Yep.
And then they told everybody their different opinion, and the experts just caved immediately, just changed their opinion to match what the elite said. So the fundamental principle is, experts run their particular thing as long as elites can't be bothered to talk and have an opinion about it. But if elites talk and have an opinion about something, then their opinion is what goes. Yeah. And everybody will follow that along. And that's this, ancient consensus mob gossip process.
Yeah.
That's now happening at a global scale.
Because the elites, they control the power, they control the money, they control the decisions. The experts are there. They're meant to help guide the elites to particular things. But
so here's an interesting phenomenon. When somebody wins the Nobel Prize, which makes them one of the best experts in the world, one of the first things they try to do is write op-eds.
Yep.
That is, they try to say, "Ooh, now I'm an elite." They try to, and then of course they tend to fail at that. But they say, I could translate being one of the best experts in the world into maybe being seen as an elite. And they want more to be an elite than an expert.
Mm.
And you rarely see people going sort of the other way, but people seem to agree that if you want to be an expert or an elite, you want to be an elite. Come on.
Yep. We're on the same wavelength with this. 100%. It makes total sense to me. I don't know if people are listening to this and it makes sense to them. But yeah, it just totally makes sense. But where I was going with the one mind sort of thing, I think I missed the most important question there, which was, would we be able to upload our thoughts into this one sort of universal brain? So instead of technologically speaking, instead of just.
Okay, so we today have the brains that we have, and then we have these brains are designed to form a larger social brain. That is, our brains like the brain of a cat is designed to be a lone brain by itself, right? The brain of a human is designed more to be part of a larger social brain as formed by social discussion. That's what it means for humans to be especially social creatures. We don't function so well by ourselves. We function well in groups. And in fact, we are more rational and intelligent in groups as a group than we are as individuals. So we are already partway there. Now, our brains have a very particular structure, they have a very particular sort of hardware implementation. They have a very particular, say, bandwidth limitations from communication from the outside and processing speeds from the inside, and particular algorithms they use. They are one point in a vast space of possible minds. And so we will eventually start to explore that vast space. But it'll be a while because, artificial intelligence, as you know, is hard. So the artificial minds we've created are not so good. They're getting better, but they're certainly, compared to a human mind, they're just not remotely as good. So I think the most likely first step, though, will be that we will make computer emulations of human brains. That is, we will just take brains that we have now in the human brain, and then we will make a similar structure in artificial hardware, but we won't change the overall structure of that thing or its priorities or its algorithms or things like that. We'll just move it to different kind of hardware. And that's the subject of my first book, The Age of M, Work, Love, and Life When Robots Rule the Earth. I say, if that technology appears, then I try to work through all the consequences for that scenario. And the world changes in a great many ways, but what it doesn't change there is the structure of those minds. They are basically human structured minds, but able to take advantage of being in different hardware to, say, make copies, change their speed, do lots of other things. And there's a lot to explore there. But of course, eventually, we will make artificial software and hardware competitive in many cases with human brains. And then we will eventually improve both of them. And then there's this long-term future of what happens when we explore this larger space of brains. And of course, part of that larger space will presumably be better coordination between the brains. As most of the brain design won't be focused on brains that you send off isolated to do things all by themselves. They will be brains that will be part of a larger society. So the future of brain design is brains that function well in a larger world, not brains that function so well by themselves. So clearly that will be a future. But again, you have to notice human brains are already designed to a large degree to function in a social world. They are already quite a distance from an isolated brain that just works well by itself.
Will robots ever rule humans and the earth?
So in the scenario of the Age of M, these humans who are now in robot bodies and brains, they will think of themselves as humans, but they are robots. So you have to ask, does that count? Right? If that counts, then yes, robots rule the earth because they rule the earth. Now, they are not robots. They don't think they are non-human. They just think they are more advanced humans. So just like we look back to, say, our ancestors 10,000 years ago, and we still think we're the same creatures. It's not so clear they would think that of us. If you could describe us and our world to them, they might find us so weird and distant that they might not think of us as the same sort of creatures as them. And that's also, when we look forward and we see all these changes, we may hesitate and say, yeah, those are interesting creatures, smart. I can see what they're doing. I'm not sure they're us. There's an interesting analog with the Star Trek transporter type scenario. So as you know, in the TV series and movies, Star Trek, they have this thing called the transporter that moves you from the spaceship down to the ground so they don't have to have a long time transporting people to break up the drama of the show. And the transporter supposedly functions on the basis of disassembling all your atoms, reading where the atoms are, and then reconstructing a new set of atoms down on the ground with all the same structure. So in philosophy classes where you explain all this to people and then you ask them at the end, okay, you're about to get into the transporter. Will the thing that come out at the other end be you? Maybe 50-50 says it's you, and 50 of them say, no, that's not me. That's something else that thinks like me and looks like me, but that's not me. Now, If you ask the same question from the other direction, if you ask, you just walked out of the transporter, was the thing that walked into the transporter you? It's 100% people say, yeah, that was me. So now you can see it's the same question, but asked from the two different points of view. Looking backward, we're very tempted to embrace our origins as us. Looking forward at where we might go, we're much more reluctant to embrace those as us. And I think that's also true across time. When we look at our ancestors, we say, yeah, that's us, even if they are enormously different from us. We look at the future, big changes, we're not so sure that's us.
This is very fascinating stuff. I feel like I'm a geek. It's just absorbing all this information. I've really, really enjoyed this conversation, Professor Robin. And I got one final question for you, if that's okay, because I just noticed the time.
Absolutely.
And I'm respectful of your time, sir. This is a question I love asking all my guests at the very end. It is a hypothetical one, but I want you to imagine with me for a moment that you've been able to reach the age of 100. All your friends and your family have decided to put together a film for you of everything you've ever said and everything you've ever done. Don't ask me how.
It'll be a long film.
It'll be a very long film, but we get to sit back and relax and enjoy it.
All right.
Don't ask me how they got it all, by the way.
I think they're going to have to edit this thing down quite a
bit. We'll take the important
highlights, and at most it's going to be, maybe you'll listen to a weekend-long film of somebody, 12 hours of selection from their life, but that's the most they're going to get. They're going to be willing to do.
We'll call it a 12-hour film for everyone that will be there to watch it. But, what would you like that film to say and to show about your life?
Well, of course, I would like it to show that I'm an ordinary person with all the usual failures and loves and connections, so I certainly want my family and children and friends and origins and parents to be a part of that story. I want, to the extent I've made big mistakes, I want to own up to them. Big flaws, they should be mentioned or pointed out. I don't want to hide them, but once all that's acknowledged, I would still like my best things to be there. And I would like you to see sort of the big ideas that I pursued and that, seem solid and promising. And to the extent that some of them influenced others, I'd want to show that they had legs and they continue to have influence. And maybe even the ones that don't, at least show that they seemed promising, but I guess they haven't been picked up. And I just want people to see, these attempts and bids basically for immortality and glory in some sense. Like, as an idea person, that's the things we create that we hope can last forever or have, forever descendants, if not, the thing itself. And that's what I would want to be a part of it. But all the rest should be there too.
It's a great send-off message. Professor Robin, people can find you at overcomingbias.com, I believe. They can get your books, The Age of M, Love and Life When Robots Rule the Earth, The Elephant in the Brain, Hidden Motives in Everyday Life. It's available on Amazon. People can go and get a copy of it.
My website is hanson.gmu.edu.
What was that again?
.gmu.edu.
Okay.
My university is George Mason University. So Hanson, my name, GMU, my university.edu.
That's how I found him, people. Got in contact with him. It was George Mason. So you definitely can get in contact with him if you like. But, Professor Robin, can I just say thank you so much for your time today. Really enjoy this conversation. Lots to talk about. But thank you so much for joining me today on the Storybox podcast.
Take care.